as Anglicans, we can look at church history with intellectual honesty and say, hey, this is complex. And there are times when Christians as well as church communities are unfaithful.
Yeah.
But that doesn't destroy our faith in Christ's one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, because our faith in that reality is rooted in something which is eschatological.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we know that our participation in that reality, however imperfect, is a genuine and real participation because Christ has sent us the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
So I look at Catholic theology and I say, oh, well, that's an over-realized eschatology. You know, they are imagining that there's a level of perfection at play now that we won't have until the second coming. At the same time, I look at, you know, a Baptist or an evangelical who would say, oh, well, it's all just the invisible church. There's no visible dimension to this.
Yeah.
You know, and I would say that's an under-realized eschatology because it's denying the extent to which the kingdom of God on earth, you know, which is still having its sin purged away, right, is a true and full participation in that eschatological reality.
Hello and welcome to this episode of the Anglican Renaissance Podcast. I think this is the first episode of the actual podcast that I'm doing an interview in person. Part of that is because you're my actual parish priest. So you live near me. But this has been, hopefully, will be the first of many in-person interviews. You're Father Wesley Owens.
That's right.
Okay. You're a parish priest, but you have done a lot of interesting stuff. We'll talk about your stories as well. And I think this conversation is going to eventually move towards a conversation about the ACNA and Reconquista and the videos that have just been going around. But before we get into all that, tell us a little bit about your Christian journey. If you were born a Christian, if you became Christian, how you became Anglican, all that stuff.
Sure. Well, Joe, I'd love to talk about that. First of all, thank you so much for having me on your YouTube channel.
Yeah.
This has been exciting, you know, being able to walk with you through all of this and encourage you as you've been developing this this teaching platform. And so it's so cool now to be able to sit on the other side and participate with you. So yeah, a little bit about my background. So I have been a Christian most of my life, came to faith in Jesus at a fairly young age. My church background is very mixed and very complicated in some respects. My mother grew up Roman Catholic. My father grew up Assembly of God Pentecostal. So they got married and had a Catholic priest and a Protestant army chaplain co-presiding at their wedding, which is really fascinating. That does happen. And then gradually in the course of their marriage gravitated toward more non-denom and evangelical churches. I grew up going to a Baptist church, but I actually attended an all-boys Episcopal school.
Okay.
Now, as for my personal journey of faith, I would say that my faith first became very real to me when I was a middle schooler. I was having deep conversations about the gospel with my family, and I'll never forget, there was a summer when I was in middle school when I committed to listening to the entire New Testament as an audiobook over the course of that summer. And I was struck by some of the statements of Jesus that seemed so much more profound and more radical than much of what I had grown up hearing in my Baptist Sunday school. Now, there's a lot that I appreciate about that upbringing, but also some things that, as I got older, I noticed were lacking. You know, as a Baptist, we had a lot of sincere Christians who loved the Lord, were very serious about the authority of the Bible, but there was a very significant lack of attention to historical Christianity, to the historic church, to reverence and worship. Very much, you know, I started to notice a lot of the you know, what I saw as issues around a kind of utilitarian approach to ministry, lots of business model ministry, less attention to the grace of God at work supernaturally through means of grace like the sacraments, and those things became more important to me, the more I studied theology for myself. First, as an eager high schooler, listening to sermons on YouTube and whatever talks I could come across. And I sort of had my Reformed Baptist phase where I began digging into Calvinist theology. And then I was reading John Calvin as a student at University of Virginia, where I did my double major in religious studies and philosophy. And was reading Calvin and Luther, started to notice how much these guys were quoting the church fathers.
Yeah.
So then that was my gateway into the patristic tradition.
Yeah.
Had an amazing Eastern Orthodox professor, discovered the beauty of liturgy, sort of the Christian sacramental worldview, and a much broader perspective on ecclesiology than I had been raised with as a Baptist.
Yeah.
So
I'm sure we'll talk all about ecclesiology today when we talk about the ACNA, but
we certainly will.
So you're going towards the Reformers. Did you have like a Presbyterian or a Lutheran phase, or was it like straight from Reformed Baptist to being Anglican?
That's a good question, Joe. I would say coming from the Baptist world, credo baptism was so central to the world that I had been swimming in up to that point, that really was the last doctrine to go for me. Like I believed in Christ's real presence in the Eucharist before I believed in infant baptism, which made for a really interesting combination.
Yeah.
But for me, the real turning point was looking at St. Peter's sermon in the beginning of Acts.
Yeah.
Where in Acts 2 he says, "Be baptized for the remission of your sins." And then he says, "And you will receive the gift of the Holy Spirit." And then he says, "The promise is for you and for your children, for those who are far off." And I began noticing the parallels between that and, the teaching about the covenant of circumcision in the book of Genesis. And, that was kind of the last thing to go in my theology. So I did explore Presbyterianism, but never landed there, in large part because the Presbyterian Church did not, in my experience, have the same approach to historic liturgy and sacramentality that I think the Anglican Church is a much better and more coherent expression of.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. There's probably a Lutheran watching right now who's like, "Hey, what about us?"
I did have a good friend in college who was Lutheran who tried to pull me onto that bandwagon. But
I find most people who kind of go down this rabbit hole who don't end up Lutheran, it tends to be an ecclesiological question. It tends to be, okay, what about the episcopate and all the and maybe more so the centrality of the liturgy, which the Book of Common Prayer is just so central to Anglicanism in a way that there's no equivalent in the Lutheran tradition.
Absolutely. And I think on that note too, I have a deep respect for Lutheranism. I would say that Anglicans and Lutherans are close cousins, kissing cousins. But there is a sense in which, I love Martin Luther. I love many things about him. I also disagree with Martin Luther in some significant points. And the Lutheran Church has largely defined itself as an expression of his theology, as it's been developed over time. But in Anglicanism, we don't have a single theologian that is the defining figure of our faith tradition outside of our commitment to the balanced perspective on the principles of the Reformation and the deeper patristic tradition before, and of course, we trace our roots back to the apostles, just as every historic tradition tries to. So I think that's a very significant difference. But it is cool as an Anglican knowing that we're now actually in communion with a number of Lutheran churches throughout the world.
That's true, isn't it? I think the Church of Estonia or Latvia?
Well, so, funny enough, I had a good friend when I was in seminary who was a Latvian Lutheran.
Okay.
And since then, I was at his wedding and actually got to go to Latvia and see that church up close and personal, there's been a formal intercommunion agreement between ACNA and their church.
And I guess the issue was bishops, and the Latvian Lutheran Church has bishops and apostolic succession and all that kind of stuff. So
that's right.
So did that kind of come into your question when you're looking at this in UVA?
Oh, 100%.
Yeah.
Yeah. I looked at the historical record. I looked at the scriptures, in particular, Titus, where Paul, as an apostle, seems to be giving instructions to Titus to then, in turn, appoint elders in his context. And it was very clear to me that already in the apostolic period, you had the emergence of a kind of ecclesiastical hierarchy.
Yeah.
And so the sort of flattening of ordained ministry down to presbyters and deacons seems out of sync with that, in my opinion.
Yeah, and you'll get, I think it's Vernon Staley who basically kind of argues that, yes, the word bishop, presbyter may have been interchangeable during some periods, but the functions were distinct. And you can point out when you look at Titus, Timothy, there's a different type of leader in the church who is responsible for ordinations.
Sure. And I think on that note too, it's worth paying attention to the fact that in that period, where people will try and conflate the two terms, you have living apostles.
Yeah.
You have living apostles, whereas it's in the generations after the apostles where you see the obvious need for and the consequent emergence of this more hard distinction between bishop and presbyterian practice.
Yeah, and I think that's a fairly common description of the kind of transition from advocates of Episcopal polity. I know Roman Catholics who will make that claim, Eastern Orthodox who will make that claim, and obviously Anglicans who will talk about that kind of transition period. I think James Ussher is probably one of the first to really, I know of, that did that kind of exegesis in that way. It's possible that it's earlier. I know Jerome kind of has an odd view on it, but okay, enough about that. Let's talk about your journey, because then you're at UVA, and I know you ended up at Oxford. So how did that kind of happen?
Yeah, sure. Yeah. So I was a student at University of Virginia, and while I was there, kind of fully immersed in theology. I was studying Greek. I was studying church history, biblical studies. A lot of the things that you typically wait to do in seminary, I was already doing as an undergraduate.
Yeah.
And so for that reason, when I eventually got plugged into the ACNA, in large part through my connections to a church planter, ACNA church planter, who was starting a new parish in Charlottesville, I had conversations with my bishop, with the examining chaplains of my diocese, who were talking about a course of study. This was after I had gone through the formal discernment process for ordained ministry. And it made a lot of sense for me, having had that foundation, to be able to be in a context where I could do a little bit more independent research. I could have a more bespoke program, focus on those areas of theology that I hadn't necessarily covered. And, it was also it was also nice to not have to retake basic church history classes and, basic Greek and that kind of thing all over again. So it just made a lot of sense for me. Yeah. I probably wouldn't recommend that to someone who hasn't had a firm foundation, because a place like Oxford is a place where there are a lot of brilliant minds, but kind of anything goes.
Yeah, I was going to think that, yeah.
So you'll have, orthodox opinions right alongside some very heterodox opinions, and you just have to know how to navigate that.
Yeah, so, also you got to think, at least I would think from the outside, it's kind of the center of the Church of England's, like, kind of upper crust kind of seminary, but also just people in England.
Yeah.
What was it like this? What was the state of the Church of England at that time? We're talking about this Orthodox people here, this kind of more free-balling kind of people over here. So what was what was the situation for an Orthodox seminarian at Oxford?
Yeah, that's a very good question. So Oxford University is very different from most American universities.
Yeah.
One big reason is that it's much more decentralized, because you have, of course you have departments in subject areas, like there is the Department of Theology, right? But most of the students are focusing their time and energies around these, what are essentially residential colleges. So you have your college, which is part of the Oxford University system, but then that becomes like the microcosm in which you swim. Okay. So, you're still going to lectures alongside other Oxford students, but you'll have your in-house lecturers or tutors, as they're sometimes called, who are overseeing your program and your experience more directly. And so what that means is you have some colleges that have specific affinities. So in a Church of England context, there are basically three colleges in Oxford. There's Ripon College Cuddesdon, which is unbelievably liberal.
Okay, yeah.
There's Wycliffe Hall, which
Yeah.
is the more evangelical college. That's the one I was connected to, even though I define myself as being a little bit more of a high churchman or even an Anglo-Catholic today. And then there's St. Stephen's House, which is predominantly Anglo-Catholic, but quite small.
Okay. So you were at Wycliffe, which is such an appropriate name, I think, for the more Protestant-leaning one. But
Sure.
You were technically at Wycliffe, but you were more kind of in the Anglo-Catholic sphere.
Yeah.
I know you have some connections to Pusey House.
Yeah, so I was kind of a weird animal
Yeah.
in
Yeah.
the Church of England context.
Yeah.
I would say that, whereas the American church tends to be more politically polarized, the English church, and specifically the Church of England, tends to be more polarized around churchmanship. So I was quite a weird animal. People looked at me like I was some kind of duck-billed platypus.
Yeah.
Are you a beaver or a duck? What exactly is going on? Because I would go and worship Sunday mornings at Pusey House, which is, very much a high Anglo-Catholic church rooted in the Tractarians and what's called the Oxford movement.
Yeah.
Which essentially was a Catholic revival within the Church of England.
Yeah.
But then I would go Sunday evenings to St. Ebbe's Church, which is known for being a much more reformed church. They have a strong emphasis on the Bible. I appreciated that community because even though they were much more low church liturgically, they had a strong commitment to preaching, to teaching the Bible, and it was a very international community.
Yeah.
As was Pusey House, to be fair.
Yeah. Okay, that's cool, because I think, say you had stayed in England, you probably would have been a priest in the Church of England now, or what would it have kind of fallen along? Would you have your colleagues would have been Church of England clergy?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting because I think there's much about the Church of England in particular which is really quite unhealthy right now, which I don't see as reflective of the broader Anglican communion.
Yeah.
And unfortunately, when I would interact with other Anglican seminarians at Wycliffe and in the broader university, I found that very few of them were actually even really aware of what was going on in the broader communion. There was quite a lot of ignorance, which comes from a kind of, rooted in history, kind of a colonial mindset. I think a lot of Church of England folks tend to think, well, we're the mother church, we're the ones who define the identity of Anglicanism, and not everyone has awakened to the fact that really the center of gravity is the global South, and that there's a much stronger Orthodox center at play in our broader communion.
So, I guess let's talk about the state of the global communion while you were there. When you went there, Rowan Williams would have been the Archbishop, right? Or
no, so Justin Welby was the Archbishop of Canterbury, and funny enough, I actually met him.
Okay, yeah, cool.
So he came to Wycliffe Hall while I was a student there, and I'll be honest, Joe, I had a really negative experience. I was very polite. I said, Archbishop Justin, it's so great to see you. I'm an ordinand in the Anglican Church in North America. And when I told him that, he basically just glared at me. Got really defensive. And I pushed back on a few things he had said to me, and then his handler kind of gave me the look and said, "Okay, time to go."
Yeah.
So that was my experience. I have some
negative experiences with Welby, there. And then it seems like just the Church of England in general was not in a great state.
Well, I will say this, Joe. I will say that as a whole, the Church of England is really struggling. But within the mess, I've seen some of the most beautiful Christian communities I've experienced in my life. There are some very faithful men and women who are living the gospel in that world, and and doing so with integrity.
Yeah.
So you see the good, the bad, and the ugly.
Yeah.
But that's church history, right?
Yeah.
It's a world that doesn't always have neat, clean, tidy lines as much as we would like it to.
Yeah.
But you have to see the presence of the Holy Spirit working even in the midst of human brokenness.
Yeah. And so, not to get, I guess, too direct about the topic of Reconquista, but let's say we're taking the Church of England. This is still a church that is divided, that has lots of problems. But I think we wouldn't say, oh, everyone is obligated to leave the Church of England. Start your own parallel province. That's more of an up-in-the-air question, I would say, with the Church of England.
Yeah.
And there is a kind of, a sense in which there's a value in maybe staying and fighting is the phrase we would use. Do you see that as similar to the American situation, different from the American situation?
Right.
What's your experience with the Episcopal Church's state versus the Church of England, and kind of why are you in the ACNA and not in the Episcopal Church?
Sure.
Yeah.
So I'll talk about the Church of England context first, and then bring it back home a little bit. So there are a number of things about the situation in the Church of England that I as an outsider see as being quite different. One is it's still kind of an open question to what extent has the Church of England, or has it, changed its doctrine in any formal capacity. I mean, I look at some of the recent statements that were made regarding same-sex blessings as being hugely problematic.
Yeah.
And so I'm kind of the opinion that the Church of England is approaching that point where it desperately needs an ACNA style, realignment.
Yeah.
But even that being the case, there's been less of a history in the Church of England in recent times of authoritarian bishops. I think there's been a space for orthodoxy within the Church of England that certainly I do not see in much of the Episcopal Church today.
Yeah.
In my own experience, now cards on the table, I've never actually been an Episcopalian.
Yeah.
However, I did grow up going to an all-boys Episcopal school, which was a brilliant education, top-notch education.
Yeah.
But spiritually in some ways very toxic. And very much lacking in gospel formation.
Yeah.
Or really any explicit affirmation of the gospel at all. Aside from a relationship I had with my middle school chaplain, who, funny enough, was a conservative Presbyterian.
Okay. Yeah.
So, so there's my own experience there, which is limited and certainly seen through the lens of a child. But, there's the experiences I've had interacting with my brother clergy who went through the separation. Many of them were, publicly, in a very public and dramatic way, essentially kicked out of the Episcopal Church for their commitments to orthodoxy, or simply put in a position where they either had to affirm doctrines which violated their conscience, or find some other pastor.
Yeah.
But what's unique about the way that realignment happened in our context, certainly, is that, unlike other traditions where there tends to be this almost endless splintering, it's almost like a nuclear reaction. Once you split the atom, all the other atoms start splitting, know?
Yeah.
Unlike that, there was a very intentional effort to seek the intervention from the broader communion. Yeah. And so you had, these Anglican bishops from countries like Nigeria or Rwanda or, or in South America even, who were providing alternative Episcopal oversight for these essentially, these lifeboat dioceses, but then collectively, as a college of bishops, came together and established ACNA as a new independent autocephalous province.
And the transition, I think, to that has been remarkably fairly smooth. There have been some hiccups, as I understand, but it is interesting to see. There wasn't a kind of defection from the Episcopal Church over here and over here and over here, and then they all kind of did their own things, and then slowly, what happened. Instead, there was not even an attempt to say, okay, well, I'm a bishop, I can ordain my own clergy, I'm going to break off and do my own thing.
Right.
There was still, from, say, Archbishop Duncan, there's still an attempt to remain connected to the communion as a whole, which I think is a consequence, I would say, it's just a plain ecclesiological consequence. It's just our theology that requires us to act in this way, which is, I think, why, when, I just made the video on why I'm not an Episcopalian, and it's a conversation with the Reconquista guys, and I think the difference, and the reason that there are so many guys in the ACNA who get, I guess, a little bit upset with the way that, Redeemed Zoomer, who's a friend of mine, and I appreciate, and I think, and in the video I talked about it like we're two generals in the same fight or something. But I think the frustration is because Anglicans do care about a lot of the stuff that he's talking about, and we didn't throw it away, and we didn't just walk away in the same way, that I think you can maybe be a little bit more critical of other conservative Protestants as having been that way. There are, I don't know how many Presbyterian conservative organizations. I understand they have some kind of affiliation through NAPARC, but there's like the PCA, the OPC, ECO, ECP. That is just how that polity, I think, plays itself out when there isn't a kind of very strong main line that's holding them together. And so I can kind of see the criticism there. But Anglicans have never operated that way. Yeah,
I mean, I think a categorical difference is, our relationship to the idea of a global communion.
Yeah.
Our relationship to episcopacy, right? And having bishops ordained in apostolic succession who actually are a focus of unity for the diocese and a living connection to the apostles is a great catalyst for unity by all means. It's also the case, I think, that Anglicans have not just this ideal of communion on paper, but a lived experience of communion, which takes the shape of, actual ministry partnerships where there are dollars flowing into other countries, building seminaries, building schools, having missions on the ground that are actually impacting people's lives in real ways. And not only that, but even, in our experience as ACNA members, we have bishops from other countries who routinely make visits here to the United States, who offer teachings. It was so beautiful when Archbishop Ben Kwashi was hosted at one of our churches in Roanoke during his cancer treatments, for instance. That kind of beautiful relationship is such a strong example of what koinonia or communion, as it's expressed in the Bible, truly means and looks like. It's more than just a principle on paper, but it's also something that we live out.
Yeah, which can kind of counter some of the critiques from maybe more Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox attacks against Protestantism, where it's like, oh, you see the church as purely invisible. It's just this connection of people who believe, kind of amorphous blob kind of view, which Anglicans, I think, are harder to critique in that way because we do have such a visible symbol of unity in the church. There's a sense in which the church is invisible, but there's also this visible aspect.
Yeah, I think it's we've got to be very careful of ever privileging one over the other, and that's definitely been an emphasis in Anglican theology, which historically has been very rooted in the incarnation.
Yeah,
the incarnation is central to Anglican theology. And not just, as it relates to Christology, but as it relates to ecclesiology and sacramentology and other areas of theology. It's central for us in a way that I think it isn't in some other traditions.
Yeah.
And that shapes the way that we understand the church. The church is a visible organism.
Yeah.
But it's also, the mystical body of Christ, which transcends time and space and geography and we have to acknowledge, like St. Augustine, that the visible church is a mixed body,
Yeah.
right? That you have the wheat and the weeds growing alongside each other.
Yeah.
And it's not until the harvest that we have that full separation and that we have a church that's entirely pure and without blemish.
Yeah.
But at the same time, like, that shouldn't become an excuse to just tolerate evil, immorality, and heresy either.
Yeah.
And particularly it's those situations where heresy or immorality becomes, sanctioned by the voice of the church.
Yeah.
That, Christians are, in a sense, I would say, obligated to cut themselves off from that for the sake of their own survival, even, you know?
I think you could kind of have I guess you could say a spectrum. On one end, you kind of have the Baptists who will argue for, like, okay, regenerate church membership. You have to prove as well as you can. Everybody here is real, wheat, not chaff. And then on the other hand, you could have maybe what we would have previously identified with kind of Roman Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, of the visible church is co-substantial with the invisible church. And there's a very strong emphasis on that. And I think it's not a coincidence that we're seeing people my age, Gen Z, although you're not that much older than me, but
not that much,
kind of having this moment with traditional Roman Catholicism, traditional Eastern Orthodoxy, and then also this kind of similar idea in the Reconquista of emphasizing the visible church so much to the detriment of. Yeah.
Totally. And honestly, Joe, I think there are two, probably others too, but, two factors that come to mind for me right now that are probably influencing that trend. One is that I have a lot of conversations with young Christians, and there's a sense of exhaustion.
Yeah.
Like, Christians can look at the landscape of denominationalism.
Yeah.
And, feel this sense of paralysis, like decision paralysis. What am I possibly going to choose? I see something I like here and something I like there.
Yeah.
And, it's tough to navigate, and there were times, even as someone who was studying theology full time, that I felt a lot of pressure to make the right decisions. And I can understand why someone in that position might want to take the easy route of choosing, the biggest house in the neighborhood, so to speak, and feeling a lot of pressure to do that. Now, I have reasons to think personally that it's very difficult to do that with full integrity, just given some of the contradictions that I see in Roman Catholic tradition and also in Eastern Orthodox tradition and practice. But, I have great respect for these venerable traditions of faith, and they've influenced my faith. Now, the other factor that I wanted to mention, we live in a world that is dealing with the fastest pace of technological change that we've probably ever experienced as human beings, arguably, right? Not just as Americans or whatever, but there is so much that's changing in society, so much that's restructuring the ways that we live together, that I think a lot of young Christians are hungry for something stable. They're hungry for something that they can look at and, it doesn't change. And to their credit, there are ways that, that Roman Catholic, Eastern Orthodox, and I would argue traditional Anglican churches have preserved ancient Christian practices that provide a reassurance of that stability to a lot of young Christians that are wrestling with, how do I hold on to something that isn't just going to get ripped right out from under me?
I know a lot of people my age who are kind of starting young families, and the question that they ask is like, how do I know that the church I'm going to today will be the same as the church I'm giving my children?
Sure.
And that it won't change, and it won't be like maybe the mainline churches have kind of gone.
Sure.
And I think Eastern Orthodoxy, more particularly than any of the other traditions, has that kind of, we don't change, everything's the same, always kind of attitude. And I don't malign them for that necessarily. I also think that there are some, when you say we've been doing it the same for 1400 years. It's like,
Yeah.
well, what about the first 600 years? Might be the next question, but
Yeah, sure.
but I think it's hard to then admit a little bit, okay, I actually have to, I have some responsibility to make these decisions and to search the scriptures and find out what's true.
Right, right.
And I have some responsibility then to say, if I don't see what I'm supposed to be seeing in the church, that there's some onus on laity and on clergy to reform the church, to be actually genuinely better at reflecting the apostolic deposit, rather than kind of saying, oh, well, this church looks the nicest, so it must be right about all these things that it's making.
Sure. Yeah. I think that's a very good point. And, I think we need to remember that at the core of this is the basic contour of the Christian journey, right? Which is a spiritual pilgrimage into this, this glorious city of God that Christ has prepared for us. And, it's not a straightforward path all the time. It's like the Israelites wandering in the desert, having to live by faith each and every day.
Yeah.
The great assurance that we have, though, of course, is that Christ promised us the Holy Spirit, who he said would guide us into all truth.
Yeah.
And he said that the gates of hell would not prevail against his church. Now, I don't interpret that the same way a Roman Catholic would. If you think about that image, the gates of hell not prevailing against the church, sometimes we think of it as, the church being preserved from all error in its entirety. But if you think about it, it's the image of like a battering ram trying to beat down the gates of hell, meaning Hades, the place of the dead. Christians are the ones on the outside trying to break in, rescue lost souls, right? And the image is one which is assuring us that the church is going to be successful in its mission by God's grace, but it's in no sense a guarantee that that the church in its visible structures is going to remain pure, or have some charism of infallibility which is absolutely inviolable. The reality of church history is quite messy sometimes.
Yeah.
But we can also, with great encouragement, look to church history and see a kind of golden thread woven all the way from the time of the apostles to now, where you do have core Christian communities holding these same core beliefs throughout those times.
Yeah.
And we can use that golden thread to separate innovation from tradition.
Yeah.
Right?
You might be able to say on certain issue, okay, for all 2,000 years, this is the way that the church has done, say, ordination. And that might say, okay, this is a clear teaching then in that sense. But that's kind of gathered from consensus, I guess you could say, over 2,000 years.
Right.
In a less clear way than, say, the Roman Catholics would see it, where it's like, okay, the Pope says this, it's now true.
Yep.
Or it was always true, I guess they would say. But
Right.
the definition comes from on high and is recognized. Even their view of ecumenical councils would be that they're made infallible, or they're recognized as infallible by the papal approval.
Right.
Rather than from the kind of general consensus taken over time, which is why Anglicans, since, as far as I know, Lancelot Andrews, probably before that, would have appealed to Vincent de Loren's canon on, what was always believed by all. But even in that text, which is the Commonitorium, he talks about, okay, what if the majority of the church is wrong about something?
Right.
And he sees that as a possibility.
Right.
And notably doesn't say, oh, well, the Pope won't be, so you can just kind of... But he does say, then you go to what's older. You go to... And then eventually that takes you right back to the scriptures, which are the apostolic deposit.
Sure.
So there's still a more robust view there, I would say, that as an Anglican view, than, say... I was going to say then Baptist, but they kind of have the trail of blood thing, too, where they try to replicate it, sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, that's kind of a minority of Baptists.
Yes,
Most Baptists would not try to claim any kind of historic succession beyond just the the passing on of the gospel from generation to generation.
Yeah.
Um,
Versus
even,
Anglicans, yeah.
Even then, you get some Baptists like John MacArthur who will just make these wild and outrageous statements about history where, the picture he paints is more or less that, you had the apostles and, you had the church kind of hanging on for about 300 years, and then everything went to hell in a handbasket until Martin Luther showed up in the 1500s and fixed it. That's just not true.
Yeah.
That's categorically false.
Yeah.
But there's a very healthy balance, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
One doesn't need to go from John MacArthur all the way to, here we have this infallible pope, right?
Yeah.
And that principle in and of itself doesn't meet the terms of what you talked about with the Vincentian canon, right?
Yeah.
Papal infallibility is a doctrine which, isn't even dogmatic in the church, in the Catholic Church until, the 19th century?
Yeah.
Vatican I, I think.
Yeah.
I know
my friend Javier Perdomo has as very good because he can look through all the random old documents. There's catechisms from the 1850s which say oh, it's ridiculous. Protestants slandering us, saying the Pope can just infallibly declare whatever he wants to declare.
Yep.
And then right after that, another great example of this is there's a note in John Henry Newman's Development of Doctrine, which he wrote before Vatican I, and in it he barely mentions the Pope. And then after Vatican I, he has a little footnote that he adds to it, which basically says, and Vatican I changed nothing I wrote in here. Don't worry about it, kind of thing.
Right.
Even though he doesn't really mention, the ability of the Pope to circulate infallible statements from a whim. We've talked a little bit before privately about the Jansenists and the Gallicanists, and even during the Reformation period, there was a lot of confusion about what is the real role of the Pope in national particular churches.
Yeah.
What is the immediate journey? Yeah.
We forget too, oftentimes, that, you had this period in the medieval church where you had three individuals claiming to be the Pope. Yeah. And the way that the church resolved it was by calling an ecumenical council, right? The Council of Constance, which actually defined the authority of the ecumenical council as being, in a sense, sovereign over papal authority.
Yeah. If I'm not, I don't have the councils or the canons memorized, but there is an explicit statement basically saying these are stronger, that this is a higher authority than the papacy. You can even get Bellarmine actually saying, oh, maybe, in some way an ecumenical council could depose a pope and stuff like that. And then I think what I would, speaking of the Council of Constance, speaking about the Anglican tradition, one of the most refreshing authors that I've read has been John Davenant, who is not afraid to cite medieval guys. He loves Jean Gerson, who's an author at the Council of Constance. Yeah. And he's saying, oh yeah, that guy was closer to us than he is to you guys.
Yeah.
And he'll just, animadversions, his On the Death of Christ, which is less about Roman Catholicism, but his essay on baptismal regeneration, he basically says, okay, actually, I'm forgetting his name. The guy who wrote the sentences, Thomas Lombard? Peter Lombard.
Peter Lombard, yep.
He's Peter Lombard's closer to us than he is to you guys, So there was a lot more of an acceptance of, okay, it wasn't just crazy before the Reformation and then suddenly everything's amazing now.
Absolutely.
There was a willingness to say, this was basically an ecumenical council moment, a development of doctrine moment, where we've got people who kind of fall on both sides of the issue of the Reformation before the Reformation, and then the Reformation was the period where we, really diverged and said, okay, well, we're going to go this way and you're going to go that way.
Yeah, sure. I mean, even with something like our understanding of the Eucharist. Yeah. Before the Reformation, you have debates happening between one famous one is between Retramnus and I think Paschasius Redbertus. I think that's his name. Where they're debating. Okay, we know that Christ is present in substance, but how exactly does that work out? And Retramnus takes a view that's much closer to the Continental Reformation, whereas Paschasius takes more of, I guess you could say, something closer to a Lutheran or even a Thomist view. But even they aren't necessarily, as far as I'm aware, using explicit language of transubstantiation.
Yeah. I think even most, as far as I understand, most Roman Catholic scholars would agree that the language Aquinas developed doesn't exist in the exact ways that it exists in Aquinas. And then it is Aquinas's language that gets dogmatized at Trent. It's his description of transubstantiation. So I think, because then there will be people who will argue, well, transubstantiation before Aquinas didn't necessarily always mean what Aquinas meant by it.
Right.
So even if you get authors who use that phrase. So it's an interesting topic. It's not as clear cut. I think, the interesting part about it is if you read John Henry Newman, his appeal, unlike the way that his quote is used, he has this famous quote, it says, to be deep in church history, to cease to be Protestant.
Right.
His point isn't actually that, history is clearly against Protestantism. It's that history is unclear. And that we need a mechanism like the visible magisterium to settle this unclarity, this lack of clarity for everybody. It's a little more complicated than that. Obviously, it's a big essay, but I think there's a popular kind of pop apologetics that tries to debunk Protestantism. Some of the arguments we probably would agree with as Anglicans, but some of the arguments we would think of as a little bit like straw men. That everyone was a papist before the Reformation. Basically.
If you're expecting total uniformity, in church history, you're on a fool's errand.
Yeah.
Right. You can find that golden thread. It is there, and of course we have the light of Scripture to guide us. And that's an important thing for us to keep in mind, as well as the providential protections of the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
But the church simply has not had total uniformity on all of these secondary issues, and to demand or to expect that is just not taking a realistic view. It's not a view that I think is intellectually honest.
Yeah.
Now, how do I make sense of that as an Anglican? I think that's an important question, because certainly it would be convenient if I could clearly delineate this, this sort of absolutely unchanging, body that expressed itself in the same language today as centuries ago. You look at a host of issues where there seems to be a contradiction, especially post-Vatican II, which I view as, in many ways, introducing a lot of Protestant elements to Catholic theology. They wouldn't like me saying that, but I think that's undeniable.
Yeah.
So there's that. But how do I make sense of the church's identity, right? Because didn't Christ pray that his church would be one?
Yeah.
And that's true. But as Anglicans have understood it, which I think is the most biblical point of view here, is that the church fundamentally is an eschatological reality. Yeah. So what does that mean? Well, when we talk about eschatology, we're talking about the theology of last things. So, but this doesn't just mean, end times. Like we're not talking Baptist dispensationalist, hey, let's speculate about the Antichrist or the second coming or whatever. That's not what we're talking about. Yeah. To say that something is eschatological is to say that that we are participating in a reality here and now that is to be fully instantiated at the second coming. So there's this language that N.T. Wright uses, which I find very helpful. The phrase is inaugurated eschatology. What that means is that when Christ came, and when Christ sent the Holy Spirit, he inaugurated his kingdom. So his kingdom has a reality here and now. We participate in it directly. Every time we go to communion as Anglicans, we are gathered with all the saints and angels. We are entered into that great and holy mystery of divine worship that's eternal and, larger than our context, right? But we also have the reality of having one foot still in the world, the world of sin, the world of brokenness. And so whatever fractures, whatever divisions, whatever heresies, whatever examples of sin and immorality and such that we deal with in our personal lives as Christians or communally as the church, is the result of the fact that, we are still with one foot in the world, even as through the Holy Spirit we have one foot in the fullness of Christ's kingdom to come. And what that idea expresses is a tension, right, between time and eternity.
Yeah.
We have the awkward position of being kind of like the Allied forces after D-Day, where Hitler's fate was sealed. He had lost the war essentially by that point. But there were still Nazi soldiers everywhere. The Allies had to keep fighting.
Yeah.
Things were still brutal. And it wasn't until VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, that the war was over and peace could reign.
Yeah.
So as Anglicans, we can look at church history with intellectual honesty and say, hey, this is complex. And there are times when Christians as well as church communities are unfaithful.
Yeah.
But that doesn't destroy our faith in Christ's one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church, because our faith in that reality is rooted in something which is eschatological.
Yeah.
But at the same time, we know that our participation in that reality, however imperfect, is a genuine and real participation because Christ has sent us the Holy Spirit.
Yeah.
So I look at Catholic theology and I say, oh, well, that's an over-realized eschatology. They are imagining that there's a level of perfection at play now that we won't have until the second coming. At the same time, I look at a Baptist or an evangelical who would say, oh, well, it's all just the invisible church. There's no visible dimension to this. And I would say that's an under-realized eschatology because it's denying the extent to which the kingdom of God on earth, which is still having its sin purged away, right, is a true and full participation in that eschatological reality.
Yeah. This is reminding me of the opening to a book you have right there, Corpus Christi, by E.L. Mascal, where he kind of says,
Good segue.
Yeah. But
great book, by the way.
Yeah, where he kind of talks. Okay, well, Anglicans say this they creed with everybody else, where we say one holy Catholic and Apostolic Church. Do we not mean it? Like, and everyone else means it when they say there's the one true church, and it's us. What do we mean by the church is one? Eschatologically in a practical sense, and why does the bishop play a role in that? How does that, what's going on there?
Yeah, I mean, those are very good questions, Joe. And so in terms of how we live out Christian unity practically, I think one of the commitments that we should have is to pursue the deepest level of visible unity that we can attain with integrity.
Yeah.
And so that with integrity is key, right? Because if another church community has embraced as doctrine things which are patently false or abhorrent, to be in communion with them is in a sense to commit a dishonest act, right?
Yeah.
And to endanger oneself even and one's sheep. So it's not an absolute commitment that we just have to say, sing Kumbaya and hold hands around the table and pretend that we agree on everything when we really don't. But no, I mean, we need to wrestle with differences of doctrine. We need to identify rifts in the body of Christ which can be healed.
Yeah.
And what I think is cool is that not only does the Anglican Communion seek to do that to the greatest extent possible within itself by maintaining intercommunion relationships and, even in the case of separation, like with ACNA and the whole realignment we're having, we remain connected to the global communion. So there's that commitment. But there's also, I think, a real commitment to ecumenism that's actually bearing fruit.
Yeah.
The fact that we have full communion with the Lutheran Church of Latvia is one example of that. Another example is I think it's called the Philippine Independent Catholic Church, which is a church of a few million,
Yeah. And those are just recently. I mean, I did a video on the Martoma Church, which was an Indian church that was separated for 1,000 years. Right. And when Anglicans showed up, there's complicated history there, but they re-entered communion. They're an independent church that has existed and traces their apostolic succession back to St. Thomas.
Right.
Right. So there's always been that kind of openness to intercommunion with Christians that we can say, okay, well, do we agree about this? Do we agree about that? Do we agree about this? I've talked on the show before, too, about there used to be much more conversation between the Eastern Orthodox and the Anglican communion on intercommunion. That ended up being stalled or basically gotten rid of because of women's ordination in the Anglican communion.
Unfortunately, yes.
Yeah. But even in the Eastern Orthodox Church, especially I think I've noticed among people my age who are kind of really falling into this kind of the rabbit holes, you can find guys on, who will talk about world orthodoxy or, whatever. Their true orthodoxy is this like a couple bishops and all these kinds of things, old calendarists. There's always going to be some tension between these,
Right.
I need to have the most pure church, we can't have any problems, we can't have any participation, and intercommunity dialogue. So there always has to be, okay, well, yes, we do kind of disagree about this, but that's okay. We're allowed to disagree about that.
Right.
Well, we disagree about this, that's not okay. And drawing that line can be really hard. I think it tears churches apart all the time. People will joke about like, oh, they changed the color of the rug, and then someone starts a new church near down the street. But obviously that's silly. But it is a hard line to draw.
Yeah, I mean, there are issues that are matters of taste or preference or local custom, or lowercase t traditions, as I might call them. But then, I mean, there are those things which have been consistent teachings of the church throughout time, or things which carry great weight because they touch at matters of soteriology, or theology of salvation. We can make distinctions as Christians between primary and secondary issues based on relative importance. But interestingly, you brought up Eastern Orthodoxy.
Yeah.
I have a relationship with our local Orthodox priest here in town, and funny enough, we had the Eastern Orthodox Archbishop of Pittsburgh in town recently, and I had met him at the ACNA Provincial Assembly when he was there.
Yeah.
And funny enough, he remembered me, so he reached out to our local Orthodox priest and said, "Hey, why don't you invite Father Wesley to lunch with us?"
Yeah.
And it was really encouraging just how much common ground we had, Now, of course, they don't see me the same way as they would see their fellow Orthodox, and there are substantial differences.
Yeah.
But I think, they might hate to hear me say this, but I think we have a lot in common just in terms of our own internal struggles with unity as well, to the extent that that's been part of our experience. You look at the Orthodox churches, and the Orthodox Church in America, the OCA, has a very complicated relationship to other Orthodox jurisdictions, where, it took them a long time to be given autocephalous status. Autocephalous, that's just a Greek word that means self-headed. It's like the word independent or autonomous, but still in communion with other Orthodox churches. So you have all these overlapping jurisdictions, and it's not exactly sure to the extent to which everyone is functionally in communion with each other. And now more recently, you have these major divisions between the Russian Orthodox and those Orthodox who would associate more with the ecumenical patriarch of Constantinople. So you have the Greek tradition and the Russian tradition. There have been times recently where there's appeared to even be a severance of communion. It's not clear exactly what that looks like, but at least communion is impaired to some degree. And a lot of that's politically motivated. I mean, the Russian Orthodox Church, I won't say anything about ROCOR or the Russian Orthodox Church in the United States, but in Russia itself, there's a huge problem with ethno-nationalism, with, the Patriarch of Moscow becoming a kind of puppet for Putin and his agenda in Ukraine and in Eastern Europe. there's a militarism, a nationalism there that is quite disturbing when you take it to its logical conclusions, right?
Yeah.
And so that's something that they're dealing with, even as we're dealing with our tensions around Anglican realignment.
It's really the same, in my opinion, with the struggle that we're having, because in one context, we are dealing with, okay, the church is caving to the culture. The church is caving to the world. But in the United States, the cultural issues they're caving to are different. Yeah. And they're giving up clear teachings from the Bible in favor of what is politically expedient, basically, is what's happening. And so people in America who are fleeing that kind of liberalism in the United States, and they say, oh, the Russian Orthodox Church is so based. Well, they have their own struggle, really, with caving to the pressures of the world and of the culture and all those kinds of things.
That's right.
In Russia and in lots of places, I think that the church struggles with that. In one sense, you could even see the situation with there are people who have made the genealogical argument for the papacy. Oh, it's really just replacing the social function of the Roman Empire, and so it was a kind of concession to a political necessity.
Right.
So just because those that's an inevitable thing we have to struggle with and have to not concede to. Yeah. Always as Christians, and it doesn't mean to excuse any of that. Sure. As happening, that it happens everywhere, but it does kind of happen everywhere.
Yeah. And now, so I picked on the Eastern Orthodox. Now I have to pick on the Roman Catholics. Yeah. I mean, they have a lot of these issues too. Their hands aren't clean either. Yeah. If you look at the tensions in the German Catholic Church right now, I mean, the Roman Catholic Church in Germany, huge swaths of it are very liberal, and it's been at times even on the verge of schism, it seemed. Yeah. And Pope Francis had to pull a lot of strings to kind of hold the fleet together. Yeah. Meanwhile, you have the voices from Africa and the global South, similar to our context, who are much more conservative, much more resistant to kind of Western liberal agendas. Yeah. And you have this crisis of this crisis around the status of Vatican II in a lot of Catholic churches here in America and elsewhere, where many practicing Catholics don't concede that Vatican II has authority or full authority, or they're resistant to it, and their concerns about this synod on synodality and what that's going to do. Yeah. Now, I've already laid my cards on the table. I think there are aspects of Vatican II that were very good. Yeah. And there are aspects of Catholic practice that needed reforming along those lines. But to say that the Roman Catholic Church is absolutely united to a degree that the Anglican Communion or the Eastern Orthodox Church are not, is just not a fair reading of the situation, I think. Yeah.
Issues like the death penalty become kind of flashpoints.
Sure. Yeah. Right. Because, of course, Francis made one statement in an encyclical very clearly condemning the death penalty
as intrinsically evil, right? So never acceptable. Yeah.
Whereas you have previous popes who, in their encyclicals, have essentially said that it's anathema to deny that burning at the stake is the appropriate punishment for heretics.
Yeah. I mean, I think we talked earlier about some of the positives of the Council of Constance. The Council of Constance also, I think, said it's acceptable to lie to heretics to get them to come to council, promise them safe conduct, and then kill them. So that's obviously, I think, a little questionable today. I don't think the modern people problem. Yeah. So I think in one stroke, I guess you could say, some of this kind of clear border drawing that is done by, say, the Eastern Orthodox, Roman Catholics. We talked a little bit about how some of the Reconquista guys can kind of say, here's the clear boundary, you're in or you're out of this. This is the right way to act in always all of these situations. Mm-hmm. Having that kind of attitude can then kind of bind you to issues that are just counter to Scripture or contradictory with themselves. Sure. Because of that kind of rigidity. Right. But on the other hand, there is a danger in being too, loosey-goosey, I think is the official term for it. But like not having any boundaries of any kind, And we talked a little bit about like the evangelical mindset of kind of
Yeah.
a purely invisible church.
Sure.
And I think that is what people are kind of fleeing a
Right.
little bit towards these other directions.
Mm-hmm.
And I think, like I said before, I think Anglicans would be able to agree with a lot of those criticisms.
Yeah.
Of that kind of
Right.
of attitude.
I mean, that's the beauty of Anglicanism, right?
Yeah.
That it intentionally sees itself as the preface to the 1662 Book of Common Prayer puts it, as the mean between extremes,
Yeah.
right? I forget exactly the phrase, but you have too much laxity, too much loosey-goosiness that you put on one side, whereas on the other side, right, you can end up becoming dogmatic about things where you don't actually have the authority to make a dogmatic claim.
Yeah.
Right? You can overstate your case and end up, as in the case of the Roman Catholics, just pulling out your papal trump card whenever you need it, right?
Yeah.
Even if the doctrinal point that's being stressed is a total imposition that doesn't have precedent in church history, or at least not in the first 1,000 years,
Yeah.
So you can have errors on both sides, and the wisdom and beauty of Anglicanism is saying, no, actually, there's a golden mean that we can walk, and that's just a healthier way to be the church, I think.
You can even see some attempts kind of to walk back even now in the age of kind of more of a positive ecumenism with the papacy. Pope Francis was trying maybe to return to like Patriarch of the West, right? And now we're seeing, I think Pope Leo just issued a homily about intercommunion and trying to downplay the universal jurisdiction of the papacy. And I think he said that there have been popes who have been overly authoritarian and that has caused division. So kind of saying we can downplay this, and then explicitly names Anglicans and the Eastern Orthodox as potentially like, oh, if we could get rid of this baggage of the papacy, it would be easier for us to have that kind of ecumenical relationship. Which, of course, I don't know how you would resolve theologically the papacy abolishing the papacy, but like,
I honestly think you're stuck in a situation where you can't deny any of those teachings as articulated. The system is just woven together such that if there ever is a change, if there ever is something that is an innovation, you have to weave together all kinds of, crazy webs of logic and mental gymnastics just to try to justify it, right?
Yeah.
You can't just say, okay, well, the church was doing something problematic here, and we've reformed it to be more consistent with our historic roots. As Christians, you end up having to say, oh, well, this is really just a new spin on the same idea, right?
Yeah. There are some issues that are interesting to address, because as far as I understand, say, clerical celibacy, which is in the Roman Rite, is probably the closest thing to something that there's some flexibility on, because they don't issue it as an infallible teaching. It's a kind of administrative teaching, I guess you could say, or
like a I don't know the language they would use, but like a pastoral rule or such. Something that, in theory, they could abolish.
Yeah.
Although I will say, I've read a number of Catholic theologians from previous eras who went to great lengths to try to make the claim historically that clerical celibacy had roots in the early church as a normative practice. But I mean, you can't really go anywhere with that. And I think to be fair to Catholic theologians and apologists, no one would make that claim today, right? No one would try to say this has always been the church's teaching. Right? It was a practical response to certain issues in the church at the time, which I don't think was proportionate.
Yeah. But there are definitely other things that would fall into the category of like this was the definitive teaching. But also part of the squirreliness is that there's lots of argument, I guess you could say, even within the Roman kind of communion. Wait, was this infallible? Was that infallible? What was this? What was that?
And where's the infallible teaching on how to define that? Right?
Exactly, So in the same way that I think they'll kind of try to critique Protestantism by saying, oh, you have infallible scriptures, but no kind of infallible mechanism for saying what is scripture. You always have a backstop of a fallible judgment about your source of doctrine.
Right. I mean, so we are human beings, right, that have a particular subjective view of the world, right?
Yeah.
And, by faith, we believe that the Holy Spirit penetrates us even in the midst of our darkness and ignorance and such, and can lead us into the truth. But there's always a horizon to our knowledge.
Yeah.
There's always, errors of judgment that come as a consequence of sin. What we believe about the church's authority over time is that, there is a providential protection such that the true gospel and, the core teachings of the faith cannot be lost, right? Because if those things were to be lost, it would mean the church could not be successful, could not be fruitful in its mission.
Yeah.
And of course, Christ assures us that the church will be fruitful in its mission.
Yeah.
But, and this is a very sobering thought, Christ never promises that any particular church will survive, from the time of its first missionaries arriving until the second coming, right?
Yeah.
So there's always the possibility, as the book of Revelation threatens in a very real way, that you can have your lampstand removed, so to speak. There's a danger that a church which has its roots in orthodoxy can actually take a turn so dramatically away from the truth that it essentially becomes another faith.
Yeah.
Right.
I think the 39 Articles puts it like, just as the sees of Antioch and Jerusalem and Alexandria have failed, basically saying, Roman Catholics, we would agree that those churches have departed, and yet there isn't that doesn't mean there's been a great apostasy, say like as a Mormon would kind of retroactively ascribe to the church. There's always been a kind of Catholic line throughout the ages. And although, you get like Lancelot Andrews kind of saying, the first 500 years are very clean. There's not as much problem. Then there starts to be some problems. And then it kind of, dwindles. You can kind of get maybe more of a view of some eras were more in better shape.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Even though, I mean, so it's true, you can look at the first 500 years as a kind of golden age, but even still, like, you have the Donatist controversies and the North African Schism. You have, even in the text of Scripture itself, right? You have Paul having to respond to crises of sexual immorality in the Corinthian church and all kinds of things. And he was quite firm on those issues of saying, that there are circumstances in which you should not associate. Yeah. Because, as he puts it, a little leaven leavens the whole lump. Yeah. And there can be times of necessity where, for one's own protection, you have to cut yourself off from something toxic, you know.
And even just in talking about the Episcopal Church, I think both of you and I know people in the Episcopal Church who either are or were faithful. I talked a little bit about this in one of my videos, but like, I know people who, talking about little leaven leavens the whole lump, who went in very Orthodox, went into say a seminary or went into parish life, and slowly, just because of the environment, lost a lot of the distinctives of Orthodoxy and just ended up conforming to their environment.
That's the thing. There is so much pressure in a lot of those spaces to conform that anyone who thinks they're going to just waltz in and be immune to that is being prideful. Yeah. We always have to recognize that our environment has an impact on us. Yeah. Now, does that mean that we just cut ourselves off and retreat to these, to these spaces where there's no conflict, there's no one we disagree with? Yeah. No, of course not. But we have to be realistic about, how much support we need and how much resistance we can manage before we're brought to our uttermost limit, And I think, what we have to keep in mind too is this notion that, local churches can fail. Yeah. Right? and not just individual parishes, but entire dioceses, entire provinces, right?
Yeah.
It is possible for a large body of Christians, even with deep historic roots, to wander or even disappear. I mean, look at all the pressures that were placed on many of the ancient churches in the Middle East, for instance, that were pretty much crushed by Islam.
Yeah.
And gradually converted over time, right? Now, there are still Christian communities in some of those places, so even there, sometimes God preserves a remnant. But there are major church movements throughout history that we don't hear anything about anymore because they essentially served their purpose and they disappeared. And yet, God's picture of the church is so much bigger than a specific locale, right?
Yeah.
And there's always the faithful torchbearer in each generation that carries the gospel forward.
Yeah. I remember someone pointing out to me, I was on a trip to England, and somebody had pointed out that like one of the oldest standing churches in England was from maybe the 900s or 800s. It was an old Anglo-Saxon church or something. Maybe it wasn't the oldest in England, but it was the oldest in the area. We're talking about this church. And I was thinking, well, it's crazy because the church has been in England for 700 years. Right. And all the churches, all the things that they had built prior to are gone, have been replaced. And so when we think, oh, well, we got all these old physical markers of Christian presence in an area, they can vanish, they can go away. It's just these giant stone, well-built cathedrals that remain today in Europe, and that's and there's nothing to malign those. I think that's great, but it's
possible to keep the church, but see the church building turn into little more than a museum.
Yeah.
Now I do think that many of our evangelical brothers and sisters have been too unserious about preserving that legacy.
Yeah.
I think there's a valid critique there. But the apostles didn't have that legacy. There are times when the work that the church does is pioneering and contextual.
Yeah.
And there are times when generations of faithful Christian practice in a location can mean that, you can start digging deeper roots and creating beautiful Christian art and buildings and such. The great cathedrals and churches in Europe exist because you had entire, I guess using modern language, we'd call them nation states, were unified around that specific expression of Christianity.
Yeah.
And you had kings that were giving patronage to Christian artists and craftsmen and builders and to the church.
Yeah.
So, there are great blessings that come from that, but also one can turn those things into an idol.
Yeah.
And I think we need to have the mindset of wanting to preserve those great gifts, but not treating them as ends in themselves.
Yeah.
Which is always a danger.
Yeah. This video should already be up on my channel by the time this video is, but I just had a conversation with Father Lawrence Bausch, who was president of Forward in Faith North America, which we're both a part of. And one of the things that he said, and he said this was Evelyn Underhill's where he got this from, was, you have to ask yourself a question, can I do the work I'm called to do in this context faithfully? And if the answer is yes, then you have an obligation to remain. You're not at liberty to leave. But when the answer becomes no, that you cannot do the work you're supposed to do, you can't have a faithful sermon in your congregation because there will be backlash from your bishop.
Right.
Or you can't malign this or malign that. One of the big things I would say is a big red flag in the Episcopal Church today is there's a canon which requires every parish to permit same-sex marriages within their parish. So even in very Orthodox dioceses, ostensibly like Central Florida in the Episcopal Church, this was a problem in Albany because the bishop did not want this to happen and he got removed. The problem that comes up there is that you actually cannot even anymore preserve your little Orthodox bubble of Christianity within the structure anymore because the structure actively punishes you for remaining faithful.
Sure, sure.
So, that is the difference between the ACNA and the Episcopal Church, I think, would be...
Yeah, well, there's Richard John Newhouse, who was actually an Episcopal convert to Roman Catholicism, said, where orthodoxy becomes optional, orthodoxy is soon proscribed.
Yeah.
And he meant that, you can't just make endless concessions, right? And expect that your faction and its commitment to orthodoxy is going to remain safe in that jurisdiction. There's a real danger of being overcome, of losing ground. Now, again, our faith is in Christ and His church, which is so much bigger than our specific context. But it is important to keep in mind that we need to take this seriously. We can't just be flippant or just imagine that, okay, well, as long as things are safe in my parish right now, things will remain that way. And the fact of the matter is, in the Episcopal context, things were not safe in most local parishes. You had hundreds of clergy being kicked out, and for just affirming what the church had always taught and what was taught in the prayer book itself. The prayer book that the Episcopal Church still technically subscribes to, right?
Yeah. The quote that I got from American Anglican Council, which was a legal situation protecting a lot of the clergy who were being defrocked or persecuted under the Episcopal Church, was some 700 clergy or more who were actively removed or defrocked or treated in such a way that they could no longer pursue their ministry. And that's not just priests or clergy within dioceses. There are bishops who have infamously had trouble trying to hold the line within their own diocese.
Sure.
And we mentioned Bill Love before, who's the Bishop of Albany, who's now in the ACNA. I know the Diocese of Central Florida, which is infamous for being very orthodox as the diocese and the Episcopal Church come. But they couldn't get a new bishop because the presiding bishop and all of the kind of national organisms prevented them from picking the candidate that they wanted to be their bishop because he was had a traditional view on marriage. So it is an actual impediment to mission, to what the church is supposed to be doing.
Now, thinking about all of this, it's interesting. Recently, I was watching a YouTube video that your friend Redeem Zoomer was on with Trent Horn. And he was, talking about his particular ecclesiology. And one of the comments that he made about ACNA, he lumped the PCA and a few other churches in this category too, but he called us a schismatic church. And I took issue with that because, one, the criterion he was using for legitimate separation was essentially, when you're forced out. And I think in our experience, in our own province, that very much was the experience of a great many of our clergy, right, as our province was forming. But also, like, what exactly is the nature of schism, right? You can have a national church that is on the verge of apostasy, or at the very least that has embraced serious heresy. And what do you do in that situation? Well, if you have a global communion, as Anglicans do, you go up the ladder, right? And you appeal to the global communion and its bishops to intervene and to help you in that situation. And that's precisely what ACNA did. When it's interesting that whenever we read about major points of division in the scriptures, whenever Paul is talking about unity, criticizing division, there's a moment, in one of John's letters where he says something related to this too. The cause of schism, the cause of division is false teaching. And it's the ones who are teaching falsely who are primarily to blame for precipitating that division. Now, in our case, we may have had churches that left the Episcopal Church, but we did not leave the Anglican Communion.
Yeah.
At least that was not our intent. Now, the Episcopalians have tried to claim that we have, right, because they are the church that's officially recognized by Canterbury.
Yeah.
But this whole idea of the Archbishop of Canterbury as the one who is, in a sense, functioning as a gatekeeper in Anglicanism is actually a much more modern idea. In fact, it wasn't really an agreed upon position among any major Anglican groups until, the latter half of the 20th century.
Yeah.
And, this isn't an idea that has deep roots in Anglican theology, right?
It's not like a papacy of Anglicanism.
Yeah, it's a quasi-papist kind of conception of what the Archbishop of Canterbury is and what his role is. It's one thing if he's a patriarch of the church, or if he's, if he's a presiding archbishop in union with the other primates of the communion.
Yeah.
But once he's functioning as the gatekeeper and, in a sense, abusing his power so as to suppress the votes and the opinions of the majority of the Anglican churches, that's a huge problem.
Yeah.
And I think what's happening is that, you have a lot of this, which is really, in my view, rooted in colonialism, and that's slowly being overturned as, it's increasingly undeniable that the global South and its churches just are so enormous and so vastly outnumbering Anglicans in the West that, you can't pretend that the Archbishop of Canterbury is in the seat of power anymore. It's just like the illusion is falling apart.
Yeah. And you can't even have a conversation across with a mutual agreed upon standard anymore. Because one of the things actually Trent brought up in his video is the way that Trent argued you should classify different denominations, let's say, is what do you think is infallible? And so he would say, oh, well, liberals don't think anything's infallible down here. So there's no agreed upon even method of conversation.
Sure.
And then up here, there's, Protestants would say, oh, just the Bible is infallible. And then he would say Roman Catholics and Eastern Orthodox have a magisterium of some kind. And they have all the other things that are infallible. And so at that point, that kind of sets the groundwork for, here's the conversations we can have, the theological work we can do. Can we talk about this, that, and the other thing? Because there are disagreements in the ACNA.
Sure.
But the province is committed to the infallibility of the Bible. So we can say, okay, you're wrong because this. This kind of conversations haven't even been seriously thought, considered possible within the Episcopal Church anymore, because they don't hold any real standards. The infallibility of Scripture is not recognized. Yeah.
In fact, you'll find many instances where even the notion is laughed at. You know, it's seen as absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah.
Some people may be aware of figures like John Shelby Spong, who, is no longer a player, but for decades was a self-proclaimed non-theist, and yet he was an Episcopal bishop.
Yeah.
You had bishops who denied the resurrection.
Yeah.
And all of this was long before even the issue bubbled to the surface of human sexuality.
Yeah.
And so all of this is deeply rooted in that crisis of authority, you know. And most Anglican bishops in our context that you speak to will say, the primary issue as to why that separation became necessary was, the issue of authority.
Yeah.
How do we understand the Bible? What is our commitment to historic Christianity?
Yeah.
And, we have taken great sacrifices, I think, as a national church in order to stay faithful to that.
Yeah.
It is also an interesting question. So we talk about magisterial authority in our context as well as in Roman Catholic or Eastern Orthodox contexts. I think one aspect of our perspective that's unique is that we hold to something more along the lines of a branch theory
Yeah.
of the church, right? And so for that reason, I think it's possible for us as Anglicans to look at the great schism between the Eastern and Western churches as a kind of turning point. You know, I think there are many reasons to look at that and say that was illegitimate.
Yeah.
And the Pope significantly overstepped his authority in that regard.
Yeah.
And because of that, what you have is essentially a divided magisterium, right?
Yeah.
Where you have the impossibility of a truly ecumenical council. And as a consequence, Eastern and Western theology begins to develop even further along radically different trajectories. And, the East would say, looking west, that a lot of these issues that precipitated the Reformation had its roots in Western scholasticism that was out of conversation with the East and its perspective, and I'm sure there's a critique going the other direction as well. But all this is to say, what would it look like if those churches were able to come together and have a truly ecumenical council and then submit to it? That would be a beautiful thing. But Anglicans are kind of in a unique perspective to say, hey, this is what we should work for, and this is something desirable, because we serve as that bridge between the Reformation and between and Western Catholicism.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because we talked earlier about, okay, you kind of can get this kind of if something is universally received, if it checks the Vincentian canon, it puts it beyond reproach. That is
right.
that is something that we can trust as a part of the apostolic deposit.
Sure.
And that's a little bit less rigid, maybe, than some of the other systems would kind of talk about. I think it's more patristic, but that does bring up, okay, well, wait a minute. What about these great splits in church history?
Sure.
Do we kind of say, okay, well, this split, how do we know which splits, like say the ones between the Arians and the Nicene Christians? Okay, well, the Arians were not Christians anymore. And so we don't really consider them a part of Catholicity.
Right.
But the Nicene Christians were. Versus when we get to, say, 700 years later, we have the split between East and West. We say, okay, but still actually on both sides of this, these are real Christians and valid bishops. We might even have a complicated conversation about the Coptic Church as well, right? But how do we parse that out as a we're making these delineations of Catholicity?
Sure. Yeah, I mean it's an important question. Now, one thing that's interesting, we were talking about Redeemed Zoomer earlier.
Yeah.
His perspective on ecclesiology is interesting, and in some ways I think is probably born out of this sense that, he's almost been backed into a corner by his conversations with a lot of Catholic apologists, and is having to grapple with that and refine his understanding in a way that addresses specifically Roman Catholic criticisms. So he's sort of arrived at this notion of Protestant Catholicity, which I think very, very wisely sees the value of institutional frameworks, right, and of the things which develop out of formalized institutions. I think that's a valuable and necessary corrective to a lot of the trends you see in the evangelical world. But he ends up, in a sense, sawing off the branch that he's sitting on. Because when he's making his claims relevant to Reconquista that, almost eliminate any real circumstances in which separation is necessary, he's undermining the very premise of the Reformation itself. Now, I know he would say that Luther and the Reformers were essentially pushed out. But, if you look at Reformation history, it's not that clean and tidy. There were churches that very clearly were, in a sense, pushed out because they had to stand on their convictions.
Yeah.
And, those were not the convictions shared by their bishop or those in authority over them. But you also have cases where, it was a theological movement that took hold. Some Christians saw the truth in certain Reformed teachings and felt obligated to be a part of that renewal effort, right?
Yeah.
Which never was an attempt to found a fundamentally different church.
Yeah.
It was an attempt to reform the church from within, but, we are in the unique space in that we can't point to a single figure, right? Like the Pope, who is, that focal point of Protestant unity, but that's because it's a fundamental Reformed conviction that no such person can exist, right?
Mm-hmm. It also gets a little contradictory, in my opinion, from coming from a specific branch of Protestantism, where, I mean, if you just look at like Scottish history, Presbyterian history, there have been moments where the Presbyterian Church rebelled against impositions that were placed. They got rid of bishops, all these kinds of things. When they tried to implement a prayer book more similar to the prayer book that we would use as Anglicans today, the Presbyterians said, no, we won't use that, and they rebelled against it and started their own thing and had started their own meetings aside from the established church. I don't think that that's a consistent, specifically even with Presbyterianism. And then when you're kind of trying to lump all of the quote unquote mainline churches together, it's like, well, now you also have Methodists who broke off at a time when they weren't being kicked out, right? Now you also have Baptists who started their own churches all the time, had to redo all their own baptisms. It doesn't really fit across this whole category of when is of how these organizations came to be about.
Yeah, definitely Presbyterianism as it developed out of the Church of Scotland and in the English context, right, with Puritanism.
Yeah.
I mean, I could argue, I think, that Presbyterianism is sort of Puritanism writ large, and that there has always been an impulse in Presbyterian theology which is resistant to any sort of claims of universality and of that level of authority that Anglicans have understood to reside in church councils and in our bishops and such,
Yeah. Well, one of the guys he'll quote a lot of times is there's a guy named Robert Bailey, who is a Scottish theologian, who said basically there's no excuse to separate unless this other, and he'll give his criteria, and he's talking to separatists who wanted to leave the established churches,
right?
And he'll be like, oh, that's just what I believe, and Robert Bailey is a Presbyterian. Now, Robert Bailey, as far as I understand, also accepted bishops and was okay with the settlements that came about, which, again, modern Presbyterianism, the Westminster Confession Presbyterianism that we have today, is not the successor of. It's the successor of the guys who said we don't like that. So
right. I mean, so much of Calvinist tradition in the Northeast in the United States, right? It's born out of separatism.
Yeah.
Out of the movement, the migration of those Calvinist Christians from Britain who could not accept being part of the Church of England or felt marginalized in their context. So I mean, there's something to be said for going off and pioneering church in a new land, right?
Yeah.
I don't want to deride that. But to say that that Presbyterianism as a whole sort of is this almost monolithic institution is just not a fair reading of history.
Yeah. Oh, I just think the ecclesiological standard doesn't even hold up. And if you wanted to be particularly nitty-gritty on like the history of the Episcopal Church, right, there were things that the initial bishops who started the Episcopal Church were doing that were not, okay with the state governments, right? So the Samuel Seabury had constant struggles with the established Congregationalist church and said, okay, well, I don't care because I'm right and you guys are wrong. That was kind of how these disputes, went, and that's why there are different denominations in the first place. I also don't think it's a coincidence that one of the examples of a successful Reconquista that is often brought up is Reverend Jake Dell, who originally was an Episcopal priest, but lost, got defrocked, got targeted by the established authorities in the Episcopal Church, and is now a Congregationalist minister in the UCC, I think.
Oh, okay. Interesting.
Which makes more sense because you can have your congregation doing whatever you want. That's the point of the ecclesiology
Right.
of that denomination. So it definitely feels also odd to kind of apply a blanket ecclesiology to denominations that don't share ecclesiological principles.
Mm-hmm.
And kind of try to... I mean, in one sense, I do appreciate that he's not just saying, oh, this is only a Presbyterian issue. But I also think it's not accurate to talk about all the denominations as if they're the same, especially with... I mean, we were just talking about the history of the Episcopal Church, for instance. One of the ways that he talks about is, the reason the denominations are so liberal now is because conservatives left when they got hard. Well, but that might be, and he can point to, say, Machen and in the Presbyterian Church. I understand it's more complicated than Redeems or even puts the Machen situation, but Machen was leaving in like the 19th century. The Episcopal Church did not have large-scale schisms until the 1960s and 70s. Oh, and it's obvious that there were problems way before that were brewing. So there was much more of an attempt to remain, and to do exactly what he's asking us to do. But they didn't work.
And I think it's also just worth paying attention to what was the what was the pressure at play in the life of the church community at the time. What was the trend? If conservatives had stayed in those contexts, would they have been able to maintain their distinctiveness, or would they gradually have just become watered down?
Yeah.
What you often see in great revival movements, and I use that word very generally, great reformations, great Renaissance, whatever word you want to use, is that Reformation often happens from the outside, when you have Christians who are living communities that to some extent are in tension with or parallel to the status quo, even if it's within the same ecclesial umbrella, and then that over time is helping to reignite faith. I mean, that was to a large extent what happened with Christian monasticism, where in the early church there was this great decline in martyrdom, which meant that there were fewer disincentives for people to become Christian. Yeah. So you had more problems with nominalism, more problems with worldliness as Christians saw it. And so the first Christians went to the desert seeking to live out a much more zealous and less worldly expression of church. And over time, as they formed these communities, where you had Christians living together, praying together, in some cases ministering to the surrounding areas, what that essentially helped to do was to reignite the fervor of the church, to keep traditions of spirituality alive, and to keep prayer at the center of the community, even as you had parish churches that were more comfortable being messy and being in the world, and we need that too.
Yeah.
One thing that we need to keep in mind as well, which, to their credit, I think a lot of evangelical communities do understand, is that contextualization matters too. And you need a church that's able to engage with and able to communicate with the culture around it. You just don't want to water down the truth in order to get there.
Yeah.
And that's what we have to figure out. What is the right balance of contextualization and stability? Yeah.
I think, particularly the Anglican tradition in North America is one of the big issues, is to what extent do we contextualize? Talking to some folks in the ACNA, there's that tension there where, especially because we lean more evangelical in some spaces, to what extent do we use the liturgy? To what extent do we not? To what extent what kind of worship music is appropriate or not appropriate? And that's always going to be a struggle, but I also tend to think there's I say this as somebody who's very, I guess you could say high church or proponent of the liturgy, and think it's good. But there's also kind of a kind of forgetting that there actually is serious consequences if we don't do evangelism. So this is a serious question. To what extent do we put barriers before people to, save them really from hellfire?
Right. I think we need to keep the church from becoming a kiddie pool.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there's a deep end of the pool, but there's also a shallow end, right? Mm-hmm. And people need to go down the steps and let their body adjust to the temperature, so to speak.
Yeah.
And so if we're not intentionally creating those bridges, then, we're posing serious risks of seeing generations after us lose that touch with the gospel.
Yeah.
The church needs to have walls and windows, or walls and doors, however you want to put it. There needs to be space for people to come in, but also enough of a clear boundary that the church doesn't just get swallowed up by the world. Yeah. And so walking that line is the tension that you see in every church movement, every missionary movement. Yeah. It's very easy in the sense of contextualization to just end up becoming a mirror of your context.
Yeah.
I mean, that was an issue even in Roman Catholic context. You had missionaries, Jesuit missionaries like Matteo Ricci in China, for instance, who made great strides connecting with Confucian philosophers and even wore the robes of the Confucian scholars. And, there was a lot of progress in evangelization with the Chinese. But over time, what happened was they made too many concessions to Chinese ancestor worship. And so Christians were coming from Catholic Europe to China and noticing, hang on a second, you guys are doing ancestor worship at communion. What's up with that? We need to rein this back in.
Yeah.
And so there's always that danger, right? But it's just as much of a danger to maintain the kind of community where you're not intentionally seeking to meet people where they are.
Yeah. I know that in another East Asian example, but in Japanese mission, there was early on, there was a problem where the word for like God or deity in Japanese that they were using to talk about God, who's uncreated, distinct from all creation, didn't always necessarily confer that understanding to people. So they would have they were very comfortable with, okay, well, Buddha's a god, this other god's a god. You can kind of add them to the pantheon. And there are a lot of people who would kind of add Jesus to this like pantheon of other deities and kind of saying, well, that's actually not appropriate. That's not how this works, Yeah. And I think that there's a lot of that attitude today of kind of having Jesus on the shelf with a bunch of other things. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
That can be really problematic because especially people who think that they have it, that they get Jesus, they get Christianity, they don't really need any correction. I think that's what, are the hardest to correct. Yeah. And I think that's one of the main struggles with especially treating the mainline like a mission field, which sometimes you'll see people say is that the mainline thinks they got it down. They think they know Jesus, they think they got everything figured out, and that this is real Christianity or something. Meanwhile, they're having like seances to talk to like bishops' dead sons and stuff.
I mean, it's one thing to say, hey, we recognize there are going to be non-Christians visiting our church, and we want to equip our church to evangelize them. But if you are fundamentally having to say, like, I have to evangelize my parish, they don't understand the gospel, then what even are you doing at that point? Yeah. How can you still have a coherent notion of church if you have people who are at the core of your community who don't have that basic faith? Now, does that describe all Episcopalians or any group? No, of course not. But there are communities in those spaces where, where things have been so distorted, and not just in the Episcopal Church. I mean, I can show you websites of ELCA churches where they pray to Mother Goddess and have drum circles and all kinds of stuff. And even in Roman Catholic contexts, talk about overstepping with contextualization. Well, there was that whole issue a few years ago where they brought the statue of the Amazonian goddess Pachamama into Vatican City.
Yeah.
And, there were people trying to say, well, it's basically the Virgin Mary. And then other people, including Pope Francis, actually referred to this thing as Pachamama.
Yeah.
Clearly, there was either some radical misunderstanding there, or the church was intentionally adopting a kind of universalist attitude or kind of religious indifferentism that is really dangerous.
Yeah, which Francis would repeat in other situations, like where he said all religions are paths to God and things like that. So I don't think that's a unrealistic reading of that situation.
Mm-hmm.
I think, and I would say that was basically the beginning of the kind of liberalization attitude that occurred in the Episcopal Church.
Yeah.
I mean, it's interesting because we do have an article in the 39 Articles that says, not every path is equal. Our path, like Jesus is the only way.
Yeah.
You can't say that people are saved by following their own path, whatever their religion is. But that is the most tempting, I would say, for the average person. I know lots of people who can be very conservative on niche issues in theology, but then they have a friend or a neighbor who's a very faithful practitioner of some other religion, and they want to be able to kind of make a cutout exception for that person and say, well, that's okay. But I think that once you take away Jesus' line about I am the way, the truth, and the life, then eventually you take away God made them male and female. You take away, it just you can't kind of do those cutouts. This is what I'm going to take. That's not what I'm going to take. And I meet lots and lots of people who, even within the kind of claimed Reconquista is the phrase I think that people are using, but within this conservative movement, who in other contexts would not be very conservative, because they accept lots of things that are not theologically orthodox, but just within the Episcopal context, they're still to the right of center on those issues. So, they're not actually, they accept same-sex marriage, they accept other things, but they think you should probably believe that in the Trinity, which is not actually required of seminarians. I think it's so hard even to know where to start. I think too with what's the priority issue,
right?
In this denomination right now, when you don't actually have to believe anything specifically at all,
right? Well, I mean, I think the Episcopal Church in this season has tried to build its consensus around the notion of being kind of the religious voice of political progressivism.
Yeah.
And I mean, there are very important criticisms to be made about the way that a lot of American Christians have entrenched themselves in Republican politics or conservative politics, and there's some valid criticisms there. But the same phenomenon has happened on the other side, and in both cases you have a problem of political idolatry taking the place of theology in the way that the church conceives its identity, its purpose, what it means to be a Christian, what it means to be a member of that church. Those are real dangers as well.
I'd wager, I think a big part of it is there's a question we all kind of have to answer in our lives, which is where you get your meaning from.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can have other things you care about, but then they become secondary to the thing you actually get your meaning from.
Yeah.
So if the thing you actually get your meaning from is politics and these political questions, but you still consider yourself a Christian, then the distinctions of Christianity will start to fall into place underneath and subordinate to the thing you actually get meaning from.
Right.
And you have to be able to ask yourself, like, is the thing that's providing meaning in my life and subordinating everything else, no matter what I think about them, is it faithfulness to God? Because, and I'm not saying this is true about everybody in the kind of Reconquista movement, but I think there is a kind of, halcyon remembrance, deep desire to live in a time we don't live in anymore, and kind of thinking about that as, if only we could have that back.
Right.
That's the goal. That's everything. And then so some of the other stuff comes subordinate to thinking that. I wish I lived in like a 1700 Georgian parish and church. Okay, sure. But I don't. You know what I mean? Like, that would be great. I would love that.
You just want to wear the fun clothes.
Yeah, so 100%. I would, if I was in a Regency novel, like, my life would be perfect.
There you go.
but I don't live in that situation.
Yeah.
And you kind of have to be able to say what is actually appropriate for the situation that we're in right now.
Yeah. there are things that can be messy and uncomfortable, but we have to relativize all things to the truth of Jesus Christ, to his gospel, to our relationship with him, and to the ministry that he's called us to do as his followers,
Yeah.
Now, one thing I think is a helpful criticism in the Reconquista movement, and something that I would very much affirm, that I think is sort of a general affirmation that most Anglicans would want to share, is this criticism of, anti-institutionalism, certainly anti-creedalism.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've noticed, Joe, and your journey to faith is different than mine, of course. So I spent more years in the sort of mainstream American evangelical milieu than you did. But certainly I noticed that there was this attempt to appeal to the, I'm spiritual but not religious attitude by essentially turning Jesus into someone who was spiritual but not religious.
Yeah.
And you have the whole Jefferson Bethke, Jesus hates religion kind of movement. Yeah. You have the whole, it's not a religion, it's a relationship.
Yeah.
But I mean, you look at, what do you actually consider to be a relationship? Religion comes from religio, which means binding together, right?
Yeah.
Binding together. It's also related to religare, this idea of to rule, right? And so you have something which is very much, I would say, about relationship, and a particular understanding of that as being more than just subjective feelings about someone, but actual, real, concrete interactions, shared practices, a shared culture, shared values, shared rituals.
Yeah.
You think about a family in relationship with itself, eating dinner together, praying together, having a specific pattern of how they live together, and even who does the chores, right? Who takes out the trash, right?
Yeah.
There are all kinds of expectations and patterns of interaction that, are part of the context of what it means to be in relationship, that, are critical to that relationship. There's no such thing as a relationship in the true sense that's purely emotive, totally abstract, and of course, if you look at the life of Jesus, here was someone who never broke the actual law of Moses, right? Yeah. Certainly he criticized the fence laws of the Pharisees and all those ways that the Judaism of his time had gone beyond the law of Moses.
Yeah.
But, he makes very clear, I came not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. Jesus observed Jewish ritual practices.
Like Hanukkah, which isn't even in the Torah.
Yeah, absolutely. And so this was a part of Jesus' life. And then, of course, we understand that to be a big part of the early church, too, and how it developed its theology and its practice. Being religious was in no sense antithetical to the idea of a pure and a heartfelt relationship with someone, right? Yeah. But evangelicalism has very much pitted the idea of institutions, practices, rituals against the idea of authenticity, or genuine, heartfelt emotions, connection with another person. Those are kind of at odds in an evangelical framework in a way that just would make no sense to most Christians throughout history, or most Christians around the world today.
Yeah. I mean, you're, like you said, I didn't spend too much time in the evangelical role before, and I was baptized Anglican, but I do get comments occasionally on videos that are more theological that are like, oh, these things don't matter. Theology, really kind of downplaying of anything intellectual at all about Christianity.
Yeah.
Because I think there is a fear that, you won't mean it if you think a lot about it for some reason.
Right.
But,
right. Reason and emotion are never at odds. Reason and faith are never at odds, and knowing our faith is critical to helping us love God well, right?
Yeah.
You know, the analogy that, Gavin Ortland uses in some of his videos, he talks about how, if you have a spouse, you need to know their name, right?
Yes, yeah.
And you should probably know like the color of their hair and the color of their eyes. And if you don't know those things about your spouse, how can you really love your spouse or say that you love them?
Yeah.
There's a certain baseline knowledge about the other that one has to have genuine, full expression and relationship, right?
Yeah.
And that's not to say there's a requirement that we have exhaustive knowledge about everything, right?
Yeah.
Of course, God is infinite, and even human beings who bear God's image have a certain infinite complexity to them. But there's still this charge that we have to constantly go deeper, to ask questions, to want to know our faith. I love the scholastic definition that comes largely from St. Anselm, but has been adopted by many other thinkers, the idea of faith seeking understanding.
Yeah.
That our faith compels us to know, to want to know God more, to want to know the truths of his church and to understand our faith, right?
Yeah.
We shouldn't just be passive spectators on the road to God, but we should be truly living out our faith, but living with understanding to the extent that that's available to us.
Yeah. And I think that is maybe one of the critiques of evangelicalism. I think the topics we've been discussing today are really kind of coming from a specific demographic, mostly my generation, but not exclusively, of people fleeing some of the flaws in evangelicalism that we only kind of started to discuss. And they've been long discussed on the internet by all these different groups. But I think there's an attempt to seek something that solves the specific problems of evangelicalism. And to some extent I agree with that. But there can be a tendency to, when you're really burned by one thing, you seek the solution to that thing rather than the solution to everything. You know, you're not thinking as much about other potential problems or other potential conflicts.
People become reactionary.
Yeah.
They say, oh, I dislike this thing that I see happening in the church, and I want to be as unlike that thing as possible.
Yeah.
And so, it turns people into eccentrics, basically. And that's a problem, because there are valid critiques sometimes, which we need to be sensitive to on different sides of an issue.
Yeah.
But oftentimes there's that golden mean that we can look for, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes we just need to buckle down and be more radical in one direction too, right? There are right and wrong answers.
Yeah.
Not everything is in this comfortable middle ground.
As much as Anglicans would like it.
Sure.
Yeah. 100%.
Here's a question for you, Joe, and something I've been thinking about a lot.
Yeah.
So we've been talking quite a bit about Redeemed Zoomer. I mentioned Gavin Ortland. There was Trent Horn. All these guys who have these online personas, right? And of course, that's a big part of what you do in your ministry.
Yeah.
And I've been really intrigued because I talk to the students that we minister to here on campus. Our church is meeting at Penn State University. We serve a lot of college students. And I'm always intrigued by how few of them actually read. How few of them actually read books. And the primary way that they're processing information and getting knowledge is, through shows like this, right? Or podcasts they're listening to. And so what's happening is, almost like a reversion to a kind of pre-Reformation, pre-printing press world where most ordinary folks' engagement with theology is through a kind of oral tradition.
Yeah.
And
impressions.
And you have these interlocutors online with these digital personalities, and people are hearing kind of their expression of it, but they're not necessarily doing the deep work, reading the texts, going to the primary sources.
Yeah.
And so on the one hand, I'd want to say, hey, fellow Anglicans, like let's be serious about this and do a better job of occupying these spaces in the way that you're doing, Joe.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I'd want to say to people listening, hey, there's this thing called a book.
Yeah.
And if you really want to know your faith, don't just wait for the YouTube algorithm to bring up, all of these denominational apologists, right? Actually go and read for yourself and study theology. Even go to seminary or take a seminary class as an audit if you have that opportunity. Or go online and listen to N.T. Wright's lectures on the Bible or something like that.
From a maybe more respectable source. I think another one of the problems I've noticed as well is a good way to get attention is to say something unnuanced and controversial and kind of going one way or another. Occasionally I'll see this on Twitter where you'll get somebody who will say something either very... I don't know what it is. I don't know what cosmologically this means. It's always about Mary. There's always someone very positive about Mary or something very negative about Mary. And then that blows up on Twitter and I'll see it on my feed for a while. And then that will be the cycle. And of course, if you read in the comments, either say it was a Roman Catholic who said something really ridiculously positive about Mary, and then you get all the Protestant replies. Of course, there's going to be some Roman Catholics in the comments who are going to be like, wait a minute, I want to qualify that, or the reverse. It's going to be someone saying something really derogatory towards Mary, and you get some Protestants in the comments who'll be like, no, that's not really what the Protestant reformers believed, always wanting to clarify. Right. But that's not, of course, if somebody made a post that was just like a appropriate theological treatment of the Virgin Mary, you know what I mean? They wouldn't get views. It wouldn't get attention.
We live in a world where the stuff that gets the most attention tends to be the stuff that's most outrageous. That triggers negative emotions like anger or disgust or, even like a voyeuristic sense of, I want to go and watch these two people fight. Because there's something about that that's appealing. It's very entertaining. But that doesn't communicate. It's very spiritually hazardous, and it doesn't communicate the kind of grace that we as Christians need to have when we approach these discussions. And I think the truth is that theology oftentimes is not very exciting. I mean, it can, don't get me wrong, it can open up whole horizons to your relationship with God and show you a depth and a beauty that will blow your mind. But not everything is exciting. And so if you're just, looking for excitement, if you want the thrill of dealing with some controversy, but you're not actually prepared to walk the line in a balanced way and talk things through with nuance, then, you're putting yourself in danger of accepting falsehood.
And I would say that the balance that has occurred, thankfully, I would say, is there are good voices, I would say, on both sides. We talked about like Trent Horn. I think Trent Horn is a generally positive.
He's generally gracious.
Interlocutor.
He says some things that are a little too strong sometimes, but he's generally gracious toward people who disagree with him.
Gavin Ortland is always an example of someone. We disagree on baptism, right? But I think he's a good interlocutor. There are lots of good examples. There are also lots of negative examples. I think one of the spaces that's gotten infamous for having kind of bad faith interlocutors has been like the internet Eastern Orthodox space and Ortho Bros and guys like that. And I think part of that is because it is such an online inspired phenomenon that there are people that are coming to it. There's also a temptation to project strength, to project clarity, to project confidence. I'll see some debates. A lot of people send me because they want to know what I think about certain debates. They'll send me a debate, and like half of it is the other person just going like, "Oh, you're so stupid. You clearly don't understand the sources. You clearly haven't read it." It's like, well, okay, it's not really an argument. You're just saying the other person.
Sure.
But then I've noticed people really react negatively to just the claim that this person clearly hasn't read, but they may might not be true at all.
Right.
And that kind of confidence I think is attractive, especially to guys my age who kind of don't have a confident voice like that in their life, or they don't have that kind of assurance yet about whatever they've settled on.
Right.
And so a lot of red flag for me is always when I see an apologist who says something is clearly taught by the church fathers, maybe except for like baptism or regeneration, but like they'll say this is so clear in the church fathers, like, well, I'm not so sure that probably is universal in the church fathers. If it's something that people still disagree about. So, like, the papacy is super clear in the church fathers. Well, is it? Otherwise, I'm not sure about that. Or that, like, icon veneration, which is a big one that gets debated on. Oh, this is clear in the church fathers. It's like, well, I'm not sure that it's clear one way or the other. In you get some that say this, and you get some that say that. But if you just say to an audience of people who don't read these direct sources, oh, this is super clear, and you start to ask, oh gosh,
yes, projecting confidence is an important way that you can be persuasive. People oftentimes will believe someone just because they say it with great gusto and with great confidence. It's a psychological game. And it's one of the criticisms that you get from philosophers like Plato, right? Who understood that in a world where you have sophists and great orators who speak with confidence, and can be very persuasive, that's no guarantee of the truth of what they're saying.
And St. Augustine is very critical of rhetoric and rhetoricians. Let's read his Confessions.
Which is funny because he was a teacher of rhetoric, wasn't he? And that was a serious point of debate for him, because at a certain point in his Christian journey, he's like, well, basically I'm giving people the tools they need to lie very well. And I don't think on a moral level I can keep doing that.
And it's a real serious question of to what extent should you employ those kinds of especially most people, I would assume, think they're telling the truth, or they think that they're persuading people to the correct position. But there's always going to be a temptation to say, well, I know I'm telling the truth, but I'm still going to kind of skate around it a little bit to get them to the right view. It's kind of the temptation we were talking about before, like the Council of Constance says it's acceptable to lie to heretics. You know what I mean? But because they're heretics. But the real obviously the problem is who actually are heretics, right? So you can't really have that as a predisposition going into a conversation. I also think that it's true because what you were saying before about, it's a struggle between, do you engage in the space or do you check out because it's toxic? Is because I do know lots of people who like you said, they're not going to read the sources. They are going to listen to whatever the voices on this website are saying. And so I think it is encouraging to see more positive characters like Gavin Ortland, who we were talking about before, who are willing to kind of nuance the position and have a more subtle analysis, be able to say, hey, here's where my position is very vulnerable, and kind of address it.
Raheem Zoomer said one thing recently that did very deeply irk me. I think. Essentially, he made some comment along the lines of, there are Protestants with a deep knowledge of church history and these theological differences who really should be speaking into them publicly like this and have their own YouTube channels, but they don't because they're too lazy. And I heard that, and I mean, I'm sure he would walk that back if pressured, but I wanted to say, well, Redeemed Zoomer, these guys exist, and they're too busy teaching at seminaries and writing books, and doing that work in the academy and in these real scholarly spaces. Sure, we need people who are great popularizers of theology, but don't look around at the lack of Anglican apologists on YouTube and see that as evidence for some deficiency in Anglicanism, right? Go look at the theology for yourself. Take the texts out of the library. Read books. I think that's so important.
And a lot of the irony of the situation is, at least I find this as somebody who does like going to read all the random, Field has a big thing on a lot of the topics we talk about, like the canon and whatnot, reading Richard Tucker's laws, is you find that when they're arguing with Roman Catholicism of their day, let's say, it's almost, a lot of the same things come up. They're all arguing about the same things. Another one is Archbishop Laud has a dialogue with a Jesuit. I forget which Jesuit, but he has and he basically is saying, oh, you guys say like nobody can trust the scriptures unless you have an infallible calculator,
Mm-hmm.
and then he has a retort on that and basically says like, and sometimes it's very flowery. I think he basically accuses Jesuits of trying to turn everyone into atheists and into Roman
Yeah.
Catholics, right? But the charges are not really changing. The dialogue is not really going into different places. It sometimes does when you get a new council or you get a new pope and he says something,
Sure.
and you have to respond to that or whatever.
Sure.
But they've always been the way that they've been, and the mass wave of converts today, I think, if there is one, that's another conversation to have, right?
Sure.
Is more to do with circumstances rather than a change in the arguments, let's say.
Yeah. And I think, there's also just this very frightening dimension of sort of digital space and how that's affecting people's lives and affecting their encounters with Christian truth, right? And what's frightening is that, I had a conversation with a friend of mine who's more of a charismatic Anglican, and he was talking about conversations he'd had with folks in his church who would get on Facebook and, they'd be looking for a sign from God that they were supposed to do X, and they'd get some targeted advertisement on Facebook, and it'd be like, oh, that's the sign from God that I needed. Well, no, like you've been giving Facebook all this information about yourself based on your clicks and this and that. And, so obviously it's going to appear like there's this special providence or something in that, sometimes even when there isn't.
Yeah.
And so there's a danger if someone is deeply into Catholic apologetics or Orthodox apologetics or, anti-Catholic Baptist apologetics or whatever. If that's what you're looking at online, you're going to keep getting those videos. You're going to think that's the voice of God when really it's the voice of the algorithm.
Yeah.
And so, we need to be able to take a step back and say, how do we keep a proper perspective? What are the holes in my own understanding and my own reasoning that I need to plug? Where can I go to do that? But also, there is value in, I know C.S. Lewis's phrase, mere Christianity, sometimes gets abused.
Yeah.
But there is something to that, right? That there's that there's something we need to build as a foundation first before we get to those nuances about, how we understand apostolic succession or what exactly is the mode of Christ's presence in the Eucharist or the filioque.
Yeah. Which I'll see. I mean, I think that's also one of the flaws in the kind of ecclesialist mindset, as it's been called, or like that you have to pick the right church kind of question, especially today, because that's more possible for people to feel like they can really look into all the issues. Is that at first it sounds more, oh, we're going to fix all the problems by having a strong church, but then you still have to make the decision between Roman Catholicism or Eastern Orthodoxy, and then the debate hangs on like, okay, what did this council say this time, and what is the filioque this, and what did St. Augustine actually mean by the filioque when he was teaching it, and what about St. Maximus? And it becomes a much more nitty-gritty conversation about an open-ended source of information, because you can just go through the Church Fathers forever. The corpus of the Church Fathers is way larger than Scripture.
Right.
And really rest your everything on what outcome comes from that conversation.
Right.
And I think it can actually be a place for serious distraction, I guess, from real valuable issues of, okay, well, how would you approach an atheist in your family or whatever,
Right.
And it doesn't believe in the historicity of Jesus at all. And you're like, well, actually, I never even thought about that. I've been too busy researching the filioque. You know what I mean? Yeah.
As a priest who meets with a lot of different kinds of people, many who don't share our faith, I can say, you're definitely not thinking about the filioque when you sit down with someone who doesn't believe in God, right?
Yeah.
But does that mean you shouldn't care about an issue like the filioque? No, of course it doesn't mean that. It's just a matter of priority and of realizing that, the the church is this eschatological reality, right? And that, we can view that in two different ways. In one sense, we can say, well, the enemy is dividing us. And I think that's true, and we should lament those divisions. But at the same time, God is capable of redeeming every situation in the same way that a great tragedy like the cross led to the resurrection, right? And so you can have instances of division in the church which God sovereignly uses to meet people who are in different states of alienation from the church and from the gospel. And God can bring them closer to him through that, even in a church that has error mixed in. But what we have to do is realize, okay, what is that trajectory that we're on? What is the end goal? And, what are those issues where Christians can't compromise? Because, we want people to be led to Christ because of us and what we're doing rather than despite us and what we're doing.
Yeah.
I mentioned John Shelby Spong earlier, and I did have a friend who was an atheist for a time who said that actually reading Spong's book, as horrific, as heretical, as obnoxious as it was, helped him because it was the first time that he ever thought something positive about religion.
Yeah.
But of course he had to progress beyond that.
Yeah.
So Spong's book was a stepping stone, and don't get me wrong, it's led many, 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 many more people away from Christ than toward Christ.
Yeah.
But it's not like God can't use even broken and messed up situations for his glory.
I think that's the kind of the role Jordan Peterson and some of those guys have played for lots of people I know, is that, or Jonathan Pageau is another good example of somebody who a lot of atheists can kind of dialogue with easier because they speak in a more symbolic way. I think Pageau is a little bit better because he's actually a Christian, but the weirdness of Peterson is it's clear that God's using some of the stuff he's saying to bring lots of people to Christianity. Even his wife became Roman Catholic.
Yeah, that's right.
But Jordan Peterson himself is still not a confessing Christian.
Yeah, there's some hang up. I don't understand. I've listened to him for years, and he will say things that make you think, gosh, he's right on the precipice any day now,
People will talk about, he had a conversation with Alex O'Connor, where he basically said, I do believe that Jesus rose from the dead. And then you're right. Which is weird,
Yeah, but Alex O'Connor was like, gosh, if you went back in time and you put a video camera right in front of the tomb, would someone have walked out?
Yeah.
And I forget exactly what Peterson said, but it was something like probably yes or something like that.
So, who knows what's going on in his journey, but we should pray for Jordan Peterson, I guess. But it's a perfect example of God using people that are, not necessarily Orthodox Christians to eventually end up, because of God's grace, getting all the way there.
Right.
And I think even within the church, God's obviously using imperfect people to help bring with imperfect theology a lot of times.
Yeah.
There is out there in the world of objectivity an exact explanation of how the Eucharist is the real presence, but we don't know, and we probably will never know, I think, the exact metaphysics of the situation until Well, and I find it so telling that after Thomas Aquinas had written his Summa, he had this mystical encounter with God where, he eventually came out and said, I forget exactly what it was, but something like, everything I've written is just straw or sand, or I forget what metaphor he uses, but next to the divine reality, which is infinite and and utterly transcendent and beyond our comprehension, right? We know that we only scratch the surface. Yeah. And yet Christ has come in the flesh to reveal God to us. And so we know that we're not just dealing with some abstraction or some phantom, right? Yeah. But we have a real relationship with a concrete person who is in history, who is sanctifying history, right? And that's a beautiful thing. Yeah. So in terms of
application,
Yeah.
a few points that I just love to encourage your viewers to think about. One, read books.
Yeah.
That's really important. It's still important, even with all of the online content we have. But two, like don't let your confusion, your wrestling with these questions about different Christian traditions and denominations get in the way from living out your faith in the fullest way that you can here and now with the resources you've been given. Whatever church you're a part of, you have a Bible, you're capable of praying.
Yeah.
You have neighbors who need the gospel that you could have over for dinner. Right? You have people you can serve in your community. Don't let these conversations where you don't feel like there's been resolution for you get in the way of doing what Christ called us to do.
Yeah.
Jesus said that he gave us a commandment to love one another as he loves us.
Yeah.
And that's not something that we can just sideline while we figure out our theology. Right?
Yeah.
We need to persevere in living the faith, understanding that, we have more knowledge to grow in.
Yeah.
And I think that's exciting, you know. It's exciting. And be encouraged too that, whether you're wrestling with, what communion should I be a part of, at least now in a post-Vatican II world, most Protestants, most Roman Catholics, Anglicans would be able to look at each other and say, hey, we accept that you're our brothers and sisters, that we're on the same journey of salvation, even though we think you're wrong in these areas. And the Orthodox, they're coming along too.
Yeah.
They might be a couple steps further back from that, but but again, it depends on your context.
For sure. I think it's a great place to kind of wrap up the conversation and recommend anything. I guess you just did recommend some stuff.
I did want to close with one thing. So
Okay,
there's this great, when we're talking about the church and what the church is called to be, there's this really great poem. I guess it's kind of a collection of poems by T.S. Eliot, who was a great Anglican, one of the great Anglican literary figures.
Yeah.
And it's called Choruses from the Rock. And there's just a brief excerpt that I wanted to read. Eliot is talking about what it means to kind of inherit the legacy of Christians who've gone before us and how we're meant to carry that forward. And how do we deal with the messiness, the brokenness, the need for ongoing reformation in the church?
Yeah.
So,
it's a good read.
This is from Choruses from the Rock by T.S. Eliot. Of all that was done in the past, you eat the fruit, either rotten or ripe. And the church must be forever building, and always decaying, and always being restored. For every ill deed in the past we suffer the consequence, for sloth, for avarice, gluttony, neglect of the word of God. For pride, for lechery, treachery, for every act of sin, and of all that was done that was good you have the inheritance. For good and ill deeds belong to a man alone, when he stands alone on the other side of death. But here upon earth you have the reward of the good and the ill that was done by those who have gone before you. And all that is ill you may repair if you walk together in humble repentance, expiating the sins of your fathers. And all that was good you must fight to keep with hearts as devoted as those of your fathers who fought to gain it. The church must be forever building, for it is forever decaying within and attacked from without. For this is the law of life, and you must remember that while there is time of prosperity, the people will neglect the temple, and in time of adversity, they will decry it.
Yeah. I think that's very appropriate for the conversations we've been having. Yeah, today.
Well, thank you, Joe. It's been a joy to be on your YouTube channel this time, and hopefully we can have conversations again in the future like this.
Definitely. This has been a long time coming. I can't believe we haven't had one yet.
Absolutely.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, I'm blessed by you, brother, and so encouraged by all that you're doing.
Yeah. Well, thank you for watching, if you're watching right now. It's a long video, but it's hopefully a good one. Hopefully it has a lot of content that people can enjoy. If you like the video, actually like the video, if you want to see more similar content, subscribe to the YouTube channel or whatever platform you're listening to this on. Otherwise, if you want to support me, you can always support me over at younganglican.locals.com. Thanks so much for watching, and God bless.
Thanks, everyone.